Welcome to Project Lakota Siches, Chelek Yudalid, Parshas Reeh, Sicha Beis, page 53. The Sicha here is a Sicha on Rashi in this week's Parsha. Specifically, the Rabbi is going to be discussing the Pasuk of Voisid Bokun. And the Rabbi is going to be discussing the expression of Dveikus that it says in the Torah in Parshas Vaschanan, twice in Parshas Ekev, and once in Parshas Reeh. So I would suggest, if you want to go through the Sikha properly, take out a Chumash and have it prepared to see the places inside where it says those Lashonos of a Voisid Bokun and similar expressions of Dveikus, and the Rebbe is going to discuss the different approaches of Rashi in each one of these places. So let's begin. Ala Pasik Achre Avaya Lekechem Geimer Uvoisid Bokun. Mefarish Rashi Atevais Uvoisid Bokun. Rashi explains what's the kavanah of the Torah when it says Uvoisid Bokun. You should cleave to Hashem. Hadbeg B'drachav, cleave to His ways, connect to His ways. Gemel Chasadim, do Gemelis Chasadim. Kvar Mesim, you bury the dead. Baker Chaylim, visit the sick. Kamoisha Asa Kadosh Baruch Hu, just like the Eibishter himself has done. So, first the Rabbi begins with explaining what is Rashi coming to address here in the Pasuk. Kavanasa shel Rashi bepashtos, the intention of Rashi on a very simple level, huliyashav atmiyah b'zeh, is to answer the question here. V'chi efsheli dovek bavaya lekechem, is it possible to use an expression of dveikus, that a person attaches and cleaves to the Eibishter himself? Which is, as we'll see, a question that Rashi himself brings up before in Parshas Ekev. So Rashi here as well is answering this question. Metaretz, and Rashi answers, Shepirish HaKosavu Hadbeig B'drachav. You're attaching to the Eibishter through going in his ways. Gmel Chasadim V'chulu K'moisha Asa Kadosh Baruch Hu. Shal Yidei Atadovik Bar Kadosh Baruch Hu. Through going in his ways is how you become attached to the Eibishter himself. Tzarech Lahavin, however, we have the following questions on this Rashi. Aleph, number one, Inyin Zeh Shal Adam Lidovik Bar Kadosh Baruch Hu. This is mentioned in the Torah before, that a person should attach and cleave to Hashem. The Seif Parshas Ekev, the pasuk there says Uladovka boy, cleave to Him. V'oid lifnei, earlier on in Parshas Ekev as well, Uvoisid Bok. Ubekol zeh ein Rashi masbir sham ki beParshas Seinu. There Rashi does not explain the meaning of Dveikus like he does here in Parshas Reeh. Shein yonei Dveikus b'drachav, that it means Dveikus in the Eibishter's ways. And the Rebbe quotes, Ala Pasuk Uladovka by Pirish Rashi, there in Parshas Ekev Rashi says, Efshalei Makain, is it possible to say Dveikus, to connect to the Eibishter himself? V'haloi eish hoichluhu, the Eibishter is a burning fire. Elo hadbeg b'talmidim u'b'chachamim, connect, attach yourself to talmidim and chachamim, learning Torah, u'mayla ani aleichem ki'ilu nidbakta boy. And I'll consider it as if you're attaching yourself to the Eibishter himself. That's in the Pasuk Uladovka boy. Vala Pasuk is Avai lekechatira, oisei tavoid, uvoi sidbak, ubishmoi tishaveya. Mefarish Rashi. So Rashi there says, this Avai lekechatira vit tavid loy, and serve him, vitidbak boy. Ula'ach hashiyir b'cha, kol ha'midas halalu, oz bishmoi tishaveya. After you have all these character traits, so then, bishmoi tishaveya. So Rashi does not at all explain the meaning of vitidbak boy. He just leaves it as is. So the Rebbe explains, Hinei mashalei mefarish gabi ladovka boy k'moshe pirish b'Parshas Seinu hadbeg b'drachav. The fact that Rashi in Parshas Ekev, when he explains what dveikus means in relation to the Eibishter, does not explain like he says here that it means to attach yourself to the Eibishter's ways. Yeshlei ma'atam ki zeh nema b'ferish b'pasuk zeh. Because that's clear right over there in the pasuk before, or lefnei ladovka boy, right before ladovka boy. What does it say? Leleches b'chol derachav, to go in the Eibishter's ways. So it already mentions going in the Eibishter's ways. B'frat al pi pirish Rashi, especially according to Rashi, where Rashi there explained, hu racham cholu, hu gei machsadim, v'ata gmel chasadim. So it's not only in the lashon of the pasuk, but the actual meaning that you should do gmel chasadim like the Eibishter. Rashi says there in the pshat of leleches b'chol derachav. So dveikus there has to mean something else. So therefore Rashi says it means to attach yourself to talmidim and chachamim. But the previous pasuk there in Ekev, Ubay Sidbak, Kasha. The question is, Me'acha shedvekus ba'kadosh baruch hu. If dvekus regarding the Eibishter cannot be explained literally, and therefore Rashi has to explain its meaning both b'seif Parsha Sekev when it says in the end of Parsha Sekev u'ledafka boy, u'be Parsha Seinu when it says u'vaysid bakun, in Kain havale lefarish zalu vaysid bakan emelov nepsukim elu. So why doesn't Rashi explain the meaning of Uvay Sidbak when it says it the first time in Parsha Sekev, the expression of Dveikus? Why there does Rashi leave the words Uvay Sidbak as is, without any explanation? Beis, Ledachgis, on the other hand, Mizeh Shaloi Pirish Rashi in Yonish Uvay Sidbak. From the fact that in Parsha Sekev, Rashi does not explain what Uvay Sidbak means. Now that Rabbi quotes yet another place earlier, V'chein B'Parshas V'Aschanon, Shenemar va'atem atveikim b'avaya lekeichem. When the Eibishter speaks about Klal Yisrael and says, you are all attached to me, the Eibishter. Ve'ein Rashi mefarish in Yono shel dveikus b'Hashem. Rashi does not explain what this means. Mashma she'en Yono moving b'pashtus. V'ad kedei kach she'en tzarech lefarshe. So it must be simply understood. There's no reason to explain anything. Then kein kosher. So if so, the question is on the other hand. Pirusha shel Rashi now b'seif Parsha Sekev u'b'Parsha Seinu lamalam. The fact that Rashi gives a different pshat, a new pshat in the concept of dveikus in the end of Parsha Sekev and in this week's Parsha, from where does Rashi take this? Be'imhu ka pirish be'parshas v'aschanan chulu. If the simple pshat of dveikus is like the simple pshat, like you see in v'aschanan, that it just means dveikim literally, Rashi doesn't bother explaining. So how does Rashi know to change the pshat in the second time in Parsha Sekev and in this week's Parsha? Or why, the Rebbe's question here is, Lamalon, why is there any need for Rashi to say anything? Why doesn't Rashi leave it at the simple pshat? Oi, minole. If there is a point that you have to change the pshat, what is that point? What's forcing Rashi to change the pshat? If it's not like the simple pshat that Rashi leaves it at in Vaschanon and in the beginning of Parsha Sekev. So basically the Rebbe is asking me Manavshach. Twice we see that Rashi leaves the term dveikus unexplained, just leaves it literally, and twice Rashi gives a pshat for the term dveikus, and each time Rashi gives a different pshat. So mimanavshach, does it need a pirish? Does it not need a pirish? What's going on here? Beis, the Rebbe continues, Gam tzarech lahavim bepirish Rashi shalafaneinu. Now let's take a look further into what Rashi says here in this week's parsha. Gemoil chasadim, kvar meisim, baka cholim. You should do gemilas chesed, Kvuras Meisim, and Bika Cholim. Three things Rashi mentions. Ma'u Teichna, so the first question here is, Ma'u Teichna shall Gmoil Chasadim kan. What's the meaning? What does Rashi exactly mean when he says Gmoil Chasadim? It's a vague term, it's a term that could include many different things. To do kindness, to share with others. What exactly does Rashi mean by this? And the question goes further, Hare Gam Kvar Meisim u Baka Cholim B'chlal Gmilas Chasadim he. The other two details Rashi mentions, whether it's Kvura, whether it's Bika Chaylim, are included in Gmilas Chasadim. So if we mention Gmilas Chasadim as an all-inclusive term, so what's the two details that Rashi spells out, Kvar Meisim and Baka Chaylim? Ondam Bezei Shleima. So the pshara we can say here is as follows. Shegmel Chasadim kan ein inyan prati. When it says Gmel Chasadim, Rashi is using an all-inclusive term, and it's not referring to any specific Gemilas Chasadim. It means generally, the general inyan of Gemilas Chasadim, which could include many different things. Ki im Gemel kol mine Chasadim. This is the idea of attaching yourself to the Eibishter's ways, doing Gemilas Chasadim. Asher protov hein kvar meisim baka cholim. And then you have the details that Rashi spells out, the Kvuras Meisim and Bika Chaylim. But Gemilas Chasadim is not referring to anything specific. It's an all-inclusive term that is in the words of Gemilas Chasadim. That's l'chayra the pshat here. Avalena move on, however, the question still remains, and the Rebbe has there a couple of questions. Aleph number one, the Parsha Sekev ala Pasik l'leches b'chol drachav. Before, when Rashi explains the meaning of going in the Eibishter's ways, Mefarish Rashi mahu goyim l'chasadim afatig mel chasadim. There Rashi simply says the Eibishter's goyim l'chesed, you should be goyim l'chesed. Mibli l'faret es apratim l'kvuras meisim u'bikachaylim. There Rashi does not spell out two examples of kvuras meisim and bikachaylim. U'manashtana kam b'parsha seinu. So why here does Rashi spell out the two details of kvuras meisim and bikachaylim? And if it is necessary to spell out examples for Gemilas Chasadim, so when Rashi mentions this concept that the Eibishter's ways is Gemilas Chasadim, so Rashi wants to give you two examples. Rashi should have given you those examples the first time he mentions it. Why does he wait until this week's parsha here? Beis, another question is, why doesn't Rashi mention in the details of what Gemilas Chasadim consists of, the simple and usual meaning of Gemilas Chasadim when you lend someone money. Lending money to the needy. Shouldn't Rashi bring this as the first and primary example for Gemilas Chasadim? The Torah mentions this clearly. This is mentioned clearly in the mitzvah of Kesef Talva. So why does Rashi omit this most simple and basic interpretation of Gemilas Chasadim? Obefrat shalvas kesef u chesed she'efshel ligmoil im kol echad ve'echad b'chol matzav shehu. Lending money is something that can be done in all kinds of situations with any person. V'mitzuya tedira mitzuya harbe yaiser. It's something that's found much more often b'kvuras meisim or b'kachaylim than the need of having to do the mitzvah of kvura or b'kachaylim. So why doesn't Rashi mention a more common and more basic example of Gemilas Chasadim? Gimel, another question is, the source of where we find this concept that the Eibishter is Goyim L'Chesed, and we have to go on the Eibishter's ways, comes from the Gemara in Masechta Seita. Aval, Pirish Rashi, B'shinu Bashmatis. Rashi changes and omits things that are mentioned there in the Gemara. The Gemara Nidrash Zeh Al Tchilas HaPasik. Achri Avai L'Keichem Teleichu. It's brought in the beginning of this pasuk, following the Eibishter's ways, Lahalech Achamidoisav, to follow the Eibishter's character traits, and there the Gemara brings that the Eibishter's Goyim L'Chesed. Vilu b'Pirish Rashi, Muva Einyan Al Siyam HaPasuk U'Vaisid Bakum. Rashi brings up this Inyan at the conclusion of the pasuk, on U'Vaisid Bakum. So that's one change from the way the Gemara brings it. Another thing, the Gemara Isagam Kain, the Gemara adds more details. Ma Kadosh Baruch Hu Mal B'Sharumim, the Eibishter dresses the ones that don't have clothing. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nichem Avelim, the Eibishter consoles mourners. Vilu Rashi b'Pirusha Einem Evi Beis Yanim Elu. Rashi doesn't mention these two details. B'Yaiser Tomua Adavar. And the question is a very strong one here. Why Rashi doesn't mention this? Kol echad mi Beis Yanim Anal Yanim Nilmad b'Gemara Anal Mipshuta Shel Mikra. These two details are learnt in the Gemara from a simple pshat that you see in the pasuk Mefurish clearly. Shenemru Lefnei Parsha Seinu, mentioned in the Torah before this week's parsha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mal B'Sharumim. Where do you see that the Eibishter dresses the one that needs clothing? In Masha Kosav, when it says right in the beginning, in the Bereshis, Vayas Hashem Elikim La'adam Elishte Kosnasev Ve'albisha. The Eibishter made them garments, Adam and Chava, to wear. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nichem Avelim. Mihadach Siv, Vayachri Mois Avram, Vayavarach Elikim Es Yitzchak. What's the pshat? Vayavarach Elikim Es Yitzchak. The Eibishter was Menachem Yitzchak after Avram passes away. So these are two things that are mentioned clearly in the Torah before. V'Rashi Yishmita. And Rashi doesn't bring this. Af shuhu ba'atzmai mefarish ala pasik vayavarach lekim ez Yitzchak nichamai tanchumei avelim. Rashi himself teaches also there b'niget nicham avelim that vayavarach means that the Eibishter was menachem Yitzchak. So these are things that you clearly see in Pshuta Shel Mikra, and the Gemara brings these examples. So why doesn't Rashi bring these examples? Another question here is, the psukim that the Gemara quotes as a proof to the fact that the Eibishter does kvura and the Eibishter does bika chaylim, Rashi does not quote them. So the Rebbe says, fact that regarding bika chaylim, Rashi doesn't bring the example where we see that the Eibishter is mevaka chaylim. That's understood. Pirish Zeh Rashi, B'reish Parshas Vayera. Rashi said this already clearly in the Vayera Elav Hashem, Levaker Es HaChayla. The Eibishter comes to Avram Avinu for Bika Chaylim. Aval, Be'inyan Kvoi Meisim, Havadei Lahavi Arayesh, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kova Meisim, V'hainu HaPosik, Vayikbar Oisei Bagai, Hanem B'negei L'Moshe. What's the source that the Eibishter does Kvura? That's Benegei to Moshe Rabbeinu. Vayikbar Oisei Bagai, Hanem B'negei L'Moshe, Sharei Posik Zeh, Hula Achri Parshas Seinu. This is written in the Torah later on in B'Seif Parshas Bracha. So they learned that the Mechomish Lemikra didn't learn this yet in the Chumash. So why does Rashi not bring the pasuk from later to explain, to bring the proof for the fact that the Eibusher is Koivim Mason? Hey, the last question on all of these examples that Rashi brings. Ma watam sherashi nokat kvoir mesim lefnei bakachelim. Why does Rashi mention kvura before bikachelim? Harei sidram hafuch. The order is the other way around. Hey mitzad seidem mirai seila b'chai adam. Both as far as the way things happen in the occurrences in a person's life. Bikachelim, when a person's alive, there's bikachelim. Is kaidim, that comes first. Kvura is obviously later when a person passes away. And the Heimitzad HaSeder B'Kroi, and both looking at the Seder of the Psukim, Shas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where we find in the Torah, the Eibusher did this, Shemetchila B'Kachaylim Avram, B'Kachaylim was by Avram, V'achkach Kvar Meisim Moshe, only many years later was the Kvura by Moshe. So why does Rashi turn the order around and bring Kvura before B'Kachaylim? Okay, so generally speaking, the Rebbe's questions here are, the Nigeya to the 4 times that the expression of Dveikus is mentioned, once in Vaschanan Vatam Adveikim, twice in Ekev where it says Ladavka Bay in Bay Sidbok, and then once in this week's Parsha where it says Avay Sidbokon. And what's the difference how Rashi explains them in each one of these places? Twice actually Rashi does not explain it. And then the way Rashi explains here, this concept of Kvoim Mesim and Bakacholim, the Rebbe had many questions why Rashi has to bring these examples, why only these examples, and so on, to explaining specifically that these examples are precise, that are negate, that Pshuta Shel Mikra, as the Rebbe will explain. So the pshat in all of this is as follows. B'pirish, v'atem advekim b'avaya lekeichem, chayim kulchem hayoim, ein tzorech lefarish dvekim. There's no reason to explain the meaning of the word dvekim. When the Torah brings it up the first time in Parshas Vaschanan, there's no reason to clarify what the term dveikim means in relation to the Eibishter. The Rebbe reminds us, we already learned about this earlier in Parshas Vayishlach, this expression of dveikus. When the Torah there tells us about Shechem that took Dinah and he became attached to Dinah, what does this mean? The pasuk there immediately explains what this means. That he loved her. So dveikus is an expression of love. Dveikus is the nefesh of the person. The nefesh of the person is attached to the Eibishter. How? Through love. The ava that the nefesh has to the Eibishter. It's not necessary for Rashi to explain this in Parshas Vaschanan. Similar when it says in Parshas Ekev. So there as well, the meaning of Uvay Sidbok means love, to attach to the Eibishter through love. When it says in Parshas Vaschanan Vatam Adveikim, it's talking about the present, meaning Shahayim im Dveikim Bavaya B'Poyel. That today, as Moshe Rabbeinu speaks, he says to Yidden, you today, all of you today, are attached with love to the Eibishter. V'Akasav B'Parshas Ekev, and when it says in Parshas Ekev Uvay Sidbok, so here, Hizar Alos, the Torah is giving the command for the future. When Yidden will enter into Eretz Yisrael, that even then the Yidden should remain dedicated and attached with love to the Eibishter. That's the first 2 times the Torah mentions the expression of dveikus, and Rashi doesn't say anything. It's self-understood from what the Torah itself explains us in Parshas Vayishlach regarding Batidbak Nafshay. It means ava, love. Ava l'davka by the Seif Parshas Ekev, when the Torah writes l'davka by in the end of Parshas Ekev, here we can't say that the term dveikus means through love. To love the Eibishter, that's mentioned already separately, because of ze atzmai, and right here, before this, in this very pasuk, la'ava savai lekecha, la'lechas b'chol derachav, v'mesayim l'davka. The Torah just said to love the Eibishter, and then it says to go on his ways, and then it says an additional thing, l'davka. So it's impossible to say that the Torah repeats the command for Ava after it already said la'avas havaya lekecha. So Valkarchach Tzarech Loimar Sha'Kavana LeDveikus Yesa Klal is that the term Dveikus here is not specifically through love, but it's something more general. Dahainu la'acharei shebol avas havaya lekechem, following a person that already has achieved Ava to love the Eibishter. The Gam laleches b'chol derachav, and also to go in the Eibishter's ways. She'isala oid v'yagia lepchinas u'ledavka boy. It's a higher level that the Eibishter commands. A person comes to the level of Dveikus. The dafka by mamish, to be literally attached to the Eibishter, not only through the emotion, not only through Ava, but there's something even more powerful that's expressed, more inclusive, more general, that's included in the word dveikus, that you're connected and attached to the Eibishter. That's what we see from the pshat of the pasuk. It can't be Ava like it would usually mean. So this is where Rashi has the question. Is it possible to interpret the term dveikus literally to be really attached to the Eibishter? So what Rashi's question is here is, how could we interpret the concept of dveikus that it's higher and more than just love regarding the Eibishter? So in other words, the real thing behind the words of Rashi is not just a question that Rashi says that the Eibishter is Eishaych Lahu. Rashi has a hechrich in the pasuk itself where you see that it's not Ava. It says Ava before, so it has to be Dveikus. If so, now the question becomes, so how could you use the term Dveikus to be attached, to be one with the Eibishter? What does this mean? And therefore Rashi explains, Hadbek b'talmidim b'chachamim. Teira is saying, connect the Talmidim and Chachamim. And then I will consider it as if you are one with the Eibishter himself. So the term of Dveikus is being used here through the fact that a person is becoming one with Talmidim and Chachamim. Then you become one with the Eibishter. That's the pshat in the end of Parshas Eikev. So we have Ava, and then we have Dveikus, which literally means Dveikus, to be attached, to become one, and that's through attaching yourself to Talmidim and Chachamim. So now the Rebbe comes to this week's parsha, where it says, "Uvaysid Bakan." Pasuk b'parsha seino achrei avay lekechem telechu v'smitzleisav tishmuru goymer uvaysid bakon nemar. So let's look first at the context of the whole parsha. What are we speaking about here? Nemar be'emtza parsha adona b'novi sheker meisis u'midyach. The Torah is speaking about a novi sheker that comes and convinces Yidden to serve avodah zarah. And the Torah says as follows: Ki yakum b'kir b'chon navi achaylim goymer uva oizva moifis. There's a prophet. He comes, he dreams, and he makes miracles. And he says, "V'novdem, let's serve avodah zarah le'sishmal divrei hanavi yahu." Don't listen to this navi. Ki menase avay lekechem eschem ladas yeshchem oivim es avay lekechem. The Eibishter is testing you to see whether you love the Eibishter or not. B'chol levavchem v'chol nafshchem, with all your heart and all your soul. So the whole theme of the parsha is what? Speaking about the fact that the Eibishter is testing the level of love that they have for the Eibishter. Are they going to be torn away from their connection for their love to the Eibishter through this Navi or not? It's all about the Ava. Let's see. So if that's the case, the Torah is saying, don't follow this Navi because the Eibishter is testing you. And right away it says, rather, move on, the point of this pasuk here is to negate and take away the words of what the Navi Sheker is telling you. He says, let's serve avodah zarah. Over here the Torah is warning you and telling you, no, you should follow the Eibishter instead of a novdein to serve the Eibishter. That's the context of the psukim, and it's clear what the Torah means here. However, when the Torah adds the additional words at the end of this, and you should attach yourself to the Eibishter, what's the additional clarification that the Torah is adding with these words of Ubaysid Bakan in this context here? And it's not an option to explain the term dveikus here that the Torah is adding similar to what dveikus meant before. So we have two pshatim of dveikus till now. The simple pshat of dveikus would be ava, to be connected through love, a dveikus of the nefesh, which is through ava, or a dveikus, which really means literally to become one, to attach and become one, which Rashi explained in Parashas Eikev to be through attaching yourself to Talmidim and Chachamim. Both of those pshatim are not going to work here. Aleph, ein loy meshakavana bezel dveikus hanefesh ba'avike b'parshas vaschanan. We can't say that we're referring over here to the dveikus of love. Ki arei akavana klal is bezeh shakadosh baruch hu neisen memshala lenavi hasheker lasi sais. The whole purpose of why the Eibishter allows a Navi Sheker to have this control, to be able to perform a miracle. Mufareshisi b'parsha, the Torah is clearly saying, right before this pasuk, to test your love. Zaysemeres, she'avas Hashem, he tachlis v'ikir shel kol ha'inyan ha'medubakan. The theme, the love for the Eibishter, this is the whole purpose of what we're talking about over here. To see to what degree you're dedicated with love to the Eibishter. So how could you say that after the Torah is finished with the whole thing, the Torah adds at the end another detail that you should love the Eibishter. The whole parsha is talking about love. The whole parsha is talking about the fact that the Eibishter is testing your love. Another detail, in this pasuk, one of the things that it says before Baisid Bakon, it says Baz Harem Mefureshes, the Torah is clearly warning and commanding Ves Mitzvahs of Tishmeru, to keep all the mitzvahs. Ubevadai B'chlal and Shal Mitzvahs He Mitzvahs Avos Hashem. One of the mitzvahs included in mitzvahs is the mitzvah of Avos Hashem. It's a mitzvah like every other mitzvah. So Baisid Bakon cannot be referring to Ava. Beis, now the Rebbe suggests, how about the pshat that Rashi said in the end of Parshas Eikev, that dveikus means to connect, to attach yourself to Talmidim and Chachamim. Chein kosher lefarish dveikus b'Parshas Zu Pirusha. Dveikus b'Talmidim and Chachamim k'de b'seif Parshas Eikev for the following reason. The pasuk here is listing a whole list of things. Going higher and higher. There doesn't quote the full pasuk here. Then and only after all of this you come to a Vaisit Bakon. So it's understood. The conclusion when the Torah says Uvaisit Bakon hu achi nailasha bekulam. This is the highest level of dveikus possible. The hainu meaning she'ubaisit bakon. The pshat of ubaisit bakon over here is, and the Rebbe again says, me'acha she'iev shaloima shamachovim l'dveikus nafshis ba'ava. We're not talking about the feeling, the ava that there is in dveikus. Kanal, as we said before, that's not the pshat. So what does dveikus mean? Hainu betachlis adveikus. We're talking here about the highest level of dveikus. It's following a whole list of things. And the dveikus here means dveikus to be one, not dveikus as in love. So what are we talking about? We're talking about tachlis adveikus, a kind of dveikus that belongs after a whole other list that the person has already reached. It's a level of dveikus that's much more than just a dveikus that comes out in the mitzvah of ahafta. After all, this whole list, the dveikus here, uvaisit bakon, means a dveikus where there's nothing. This is the tachlis adveikus. That's the conclusion of this whole. This is the ultimate connection and oneness with the Eibishter of uvaisit bakon. So therefore Rashi says we can't say that this ultimate dveikus refers to the dveikus in Talmidim and Chachamim. Even though, yes, it's true, through attaching yourself to Talmidim and Chachamim, you become one with the Eibishter. And here the Rebbe explains why this is. Mitam, Eved, Melech, Melech. The Talmidim and Chachamim are servants of the Eibishter, and they are like the king himself. So if you connect yourself to those that are the Avodim of the Eibishter, you become connected to the Eibishter. However, says the Rebbe, Kivin Shat Talmud, the Chacham, Harehu Basav Adam. This Talmud and Chacham is only a Basav Adam. Ein Zu Dveikis Ba'Kadosh Baruch Hu. This is not considered to be direct and literal Dveikis in the Eibishter himself. Afilu Loi Ki B'Vahafta Gaimim Ma'itcha. Not even on the level of Avahafta B'chol Ma'itcha, which is the highest level of Ava. The Ava of B'chol Ma'itcha, over here, since this Dveikis comes through the intermediary of a basar v'dam, of a talmud and a chacham, so it's not even on that level of dveikus. Kiyim kepirish Rashi sham, but as Rashi says, Maila ani aleichem ki ilu nidbakta boy. That through this dveikus, the Eibishter says, I consider it as if you dove it to the Eibishter himself. So therefore, to say that this level of dveikus, ki'ilu nidbakta by, is the tachlis adveikus that the Torah is referring to over here, after the whole list of things that the Torah says, the highest and ultimate level of connection, uvaisit bakun means only ki'ilu nidbakta by, that's not, that can't be the pshat here. So therefore, v'kivin shekain mai dveikus alazu. So what does the Torah mean by this dveikus that it says here? So therefore Rashi introduces yet a new pshat. And he's also answering the question, how could you have a kind of dveikus which is literally to become one with Hashem? And we can't even give the answer that it's through connecting to a Talmud and a Chacham, and it's ki'ilu. So how could you become one with the Eibishter? Rashi doesn't spell out the question again. Rashi already spelled out this question of how it's possible to be one with the Eibishter in Parshas Eikev. And Rashi tells us what's the ultimate highest level of dveikus. Uvaisid bakun is hadbeik b'drachav, to attach yourself to the Eibishter's ways. Gmel chasadim k'may shas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Do gemilas chesed like the Eibishter himself. Hainu shebezeh shat dovuk b'drachav. When you attach yourself to the Eibishter's ways, hinoch dovuk boy mamish. That's an expression of your dveikus. You become one with the Eibishter literally, without even a ki'ilu. Not even a ki'ilu like we explained it before when a person attaches himself to Talmidim and Chachamim. Masha'en came, b'soif Parshas Eikev. Dulei matzi lefarish hadbig b'drachav. There, as we already mentioned, Rashi can't say that the dveikus refers to this level of dveikus to be one with through the Eibishter's ways. Meyachar shekvar nema b'pasek hakaydim lo lechas b'chol drachav. It already says there lo lechas b'chol drachav kanal. Umena hechrech lahamis by inyan neisef. So therefore we have to mention another inyan. V'hainu dveikus b'talmidim v'chachamim. That it refers to dveikus of talmidim and chachamim. So the Rebbe's conclusion so far that we have over here is that as far as the pshat of dveikus, when it talks about the Yidden's dveikus and the Eibishter is concerned, we have three different kinds of dveikus. There's a dveikus that's ava. There's the nafshi, the experience, the emotion, the connection that the Yid has to the Eibishter and the avas Hashem. That's the dveikus of Parshas Vaschanan Vatem Adveikim, and when the Torah says Uvaisid Bok. Then there's the dveikus through connecting to Talmidim and Chachamim, where the Torah says that when you attach yourself to them, so it's ki'ilu nidbakta boy, it's as if you become one with the Eibishter. The deepest dveikus, the tachlis dveikus, the ultimate dveikus, is when you're nidbak b'drachav, when you do gemilas chasadim, k'may she'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Rebbe in a moment will explain the emphasis of k'may she'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and this is the highest level of dveikus. To understand exactly why this is considered to be the ultimate dveikus, more than anything else, more than ava, more than dveikus and talmidim and chachamim, we'll see in the Hemshech HaSicha, and especially in the end, towards the end of the Sicha, where the Rebbe explains why this is the ultimate dveikus. Now, the Rebbe is going to return to the details that Rashi explains here, benigeh to going in the Eibishter's ways. Now we will understand why Rashi enumerates over here as far as attaching yourself to the Eibishter's ways. Rak kvoir meisim baka chaylim k'moishas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rashi chooses only these two details to spell out in the Gemilas Chasadim of the Eibishter. Mikivin she'azharas uvaisid bakum ba b'soif kol hatzivuyim hamenuyim b'kasav. As we said, this uvaisid bakum comes at the end of everything the Torah says. Ubeinayim, amongst the things that it said before was gam ves mitzvahs of tishmeru. It said, keep the mitzvahs. Hare muvan shatzivi al dveikus zu hadbek bedrachav hu bedava shechiyuv yene mitzvah ben ha-mitzvahs. So this dveikus has to be referring to something which is not an obligation. It's not one of the mitzvahs. Haine shalule yatzivi hadbek bedrachav. If not for this additional command to attach yourself in the Eibishter's ways, lo yoyoy seyu mitzad tzivi mefurish achad. This wouldn't be done because you were already commanded elsewhere. It's not included in any of the mitzvahs. Rashi spells out these two things, and Rashi says, and the kvura and bikachaylim should be done like the instances where the Eibishter did it. Rak dvarim elu. It's only regarding these two things. Anu maitzin shakadosh baruch hu asam ba'ifin. So we find the Eibusha does them in such a way shebedugmasam gabei adam lehayim mechuyev ligmul chesed zeh mitzad mitzvah v'chiyuv. That a person would not be obligated to do kvura or bikachaylim in such a kind of instance the way the Eibusha did it. V'rak mishum atzivui hadbik b'drachav yasin. And therefore the Torah is saying that you attach yourself to the Eibusha. And you are doing Gemilas Chesed, and Kvuras Meisim, and Bakachaylim, in these instances, the way the Eibusha did it, this is the unique thing of Hadbek B'drachav, more than just doing it, what you're commanded, what's included already in the mitzvahs that we know from before. And the Rabbi explains, where do we find the unique Bikachaylim that's more than what you're obligated? Bikachaylim. Gam b'matziv shakadosh baruch hu ba levakres Avram. A person should do bikachaylim, even similar to the situation when the Eibusha comes to visit Avram Avinu. K'may shepirish Rashi vayere elo levakres achayla. What's the chiddush here of this bikachaylim? Ime yais shebevadai kama ma'anosha v'rei of ba levakre. Avram Avinu definitely was not lonely. He definitely had from his people, from his friends that were there visiting him. So he didn't need any visitors to do the mitzvah of bikachaylim. Yet the Eibusha came and fulfilled the mitzvah anyways, to add and to do the bikachaylim, although he had people that were with him. So this teaches us to also go on the Eibusha's way and do bikachaylim, even in a case where it's lefnim eshuras hadim, where we say to ourselves that there's someone that's there with the chayla, but nevertheless I'm going to go and add even more. That's where we see bikachaylim more than the usual by the Eibusha. Similar when it comes to kvura. And here the Rebbe explains where we find kvura more than the regular, and this does not refer to the kvura by Moshe. She'ein hakavana lezeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu kavas Moshe. Rashi is not referring to Moshe asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu when the Eibusha buried Moshe. Shal Talmud lamad adayin al dvar zeh. The student that's learning the pasuk here did not learn yet Parshas V'zeis HaBracha. Vim lezeh miskaven havalei Rashi lahavi akosav v'yikberei bagai. If that's what Rashi intends to, that's what Rashi is referring to, so Rashi should have brought that pasuk. Ki'im, rather, l'kvuras Aaron. What it's referring to is the kvura of Aaron, sh'at talmid lomad kvar al dvar zeh shehoisai de HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's referring to the kvura of Aaron, which the student already learned about before in Parshas Chukas, and that kvura as well happened through the Eibusha. And the Rabbi here proves it. Shaharei, let's take a look at what happened there. Histalkusei oiseh b'mayra. Aaron HaKohen passes away in the cave. Uba pasik nema. What does it say there in the pasik? All it says is rak vayomas Aaron shom b'reish har umiyad vayered Moshe ve'Elazar. And Moshe and Elazar came down. V'lo niska shom klum oidis kfurase. Doesn't say a word about his burial. Who buried him? K'may b'Miriam. Now in the same parsha it talks about the fact that Miriam passed away. Shenema, and there it says vatik kovesham. She was buried there. By Aaron HaKohen doesn't mention a word about his kvura. Aval b'Parshas Eikev Nemar, in Parshas Eikev, in last week's Parsha, where it brings up again what happened, it does say Vayikov V'sham, that he was buried there. So if you would have thought that maybe he was just left in a cave, exposed, without a kvura, no, it clearly says he was buried. So who is the one that did this kvura? Aaron and Elazar, it just says Vayered Moshe ve'Elazar, they came down. So who did the kvura? Val Korchach, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Sasik b'Kvurasei. So it's the Eibusha that did the kvura. Af sherabim bnei Yisrael hayu bevadei muchanim l'sasik b'zeh. Most definitely, there were many Yidden available to come and do the kvura. Nevertheless, the Eibusha said, I'm going to go and do the kvura myself. So here's an example where we see that the Eibusha does a kvura in a case where no one else did it. And there were many others that were available to do it. And nevertheless, the Eibusha says that I'm going to go ahead and do it. The Rebbe adds to this even more. It's absolutely mukhrach. We must say according to Rashi, Shakadosh Baruch Hu asak b'kfurasei, that the Eibusha is the one that did the kvura. Shaharei kol b'nei Yisrael lo yadu shemeis at sheherom mutal b'mita. The Yidden didn't even know b'chlal that Aaron HaKohen passed away. And when Moshe and Elazar came and said that Aaron HaKohen passed away, they didn't believe him. Only after they saw, the Eibusha showed them the image of a mace in a bed, in a mitah, so then they believed. And also, Elazar, beloved bigdei Aaron, b'chayav, nasa kohen gadol. Elazar himself couldn't have buried Aaron HaKohen because he wore the bigdei Aaron already in his lifetime, so he became a kohen gadol. All of them, and regarding a Kohen Gadol, it says, La'avav lo yitama. Even to his father, he's not allowed to become tummy. So Allah can't bury him either. V'chein Moshe, and Moshe Rabbeinu can't bury Aaron HaKohen. Shirak Bonav Yikaru al Shevet Levi. Moshe Rabbeinu's children are part of Shevet Levi. How about Moshe Rabbeinu himself? V'shimish b'Kohen Gadol b'mei Malun. Moshe Rabbeinu himself served as a Kohen Gadol the 7 days when the Mishkan was put up and down. Those 7 Shivas Yimei Malum, he served as a Kohen Gadol. We never find that this status of a Kohen Gadol was ever taken away from him. So it's also Oster lehitam al Aaron. He was also Oster to bury Aaron HaKohen. So, not Moshe buried him, not Allah buried him, and the Yidden that only found out later also didn't. But yet the Rebbe says at the same time, this is not a case of a meis mitzvah that there was no one available to bury him. They could have called Yidden. Moshe Rabbeinu could have gone out of the cave and called one of the Yidden to bury him, but he didn't, and the Yidden only found out later. So although it was definitely an option to have the Yidden do the kvura, the Eibishter says, I'm going to do the kvura myself. So this is a case where we see that the Eibishter is kover mason in a case where it wasn't necessary for the Eibishter to do so. And as the Rebbe will soon point out, that's not the case by Kvuras Moshe. So both the Bika Chaylim and Kvuras Aaron, we see that this is not just going in the Eibishter's ways and doing Gemilas Chasadim in cases where you're obligated, but this is Gemilas Chasadim in cases where you're going beyond even a case where it's not even necessary, you're nevertheless going ahead and doing it anyways. So Valpizem move on, the Rebbe continues, She'ein masim kan lahavi aprat shel Gemilas Chasadim b'mamayna. Over here, it doesn't fit in to bring up the classic Gemilas Chasadim, which is lending money. Havas mamalisha Israeli, lending money to another Yid. We don't have a clear example in the Torah to find that the Eibishter has done so. This is a clear mitzvah. That's already part of what it says, that you should keep the mitzvahs. It's also understood why Rashi does not bring what the Gemara says, that the Eibishter dresses the people that need clothing. There is no clear mitzvah in the Torah to dress a person. And we see clearly that the Eibishter did dress Adam and Chava, because it would be self-understood that a person has to do this without the Torah adding the chiddush of hadbik b'drachav to attach yourself to the Eibishter's ways. If you're dressing somebody that's literally has no clothing, like in the case of Adam and his wife, there was nobody that could provide them any clothing besides the Eibishter. This is included in a mitzvah, a clear mitzvah, and it's specifically regarding clothing. Regarding taking a mashkin, and you take a garment that a person has to use during the day or during the night, you have to return to him his garment that he needs for the daytime by day and for the nighttime by night. So over there we're talking about, the Rebbe says, a garment that is not completely undressed, and nevertheless you have to return it to him for the time that he needs it. So most definitely it's understood that that includes that a Yid has to see to it and dress another person that has no clothing at all. So that's an obligation. That's something that's not the chiddush of uvay sidbakon. Now that Rebbe comes back to the union of kvura, so it's be better understood in the simple pshat here, why lepirish Rashi gam lekedugmen esefas akvura sa'ar and kvay meisen k'moshe kovar kadosh baruch hu gam es Moshe. Rashi does not at all make any mention of the fact that we find that Eibishter buried Moshe Rabbeinu. K'moshe kasav yikbere sebagai kibegemara. Ki neisuf al zeh shehein ein hechrech loima shakadosh baruch hu kovrei. There, it's actually not 100% clear that it's the Eibishter that buried Moshe. Rashi there actually brings two pshatim, shehu kover es atzma, that Moshe buried himself. But hine gam lefi pirish harisha, even according to the first pshat, shakadosh baruch hu b'chvayde kovred, the Eibishter himself personally buried Moshe Rabbeinu. When Moshe Rabbeinu passes away, the Eibishter wanted that it should be in such a way that nobody should know his burial place. For whatever reason. So So it wasn't an option that Yidden should come and bury Moshe Rabbeinu. It has to remain completely secret. So the fact that the Eibusha does the Kvura of Moshe is not a source for the example that the Eibusha does Kvura even when somebody else could do this. Like in the case of Aaron HaKohen, that many Yidden could have done the Kvura. So therefore Rashi is referring to the example of Kvuras Aaron when he says Kamoish Asa Kadosh Baruch Hu, that the Eibusha was Koivim Mesim, and not the Kvura of Moshe. Umeyata, the Rebbe continues, Yizbar Gam Taimel Shal Rashi, Shedafke B'Parshaseinu, Hutzrach Lefarish on Yonim, the Gmel Chasadim. Why, specifically in this week's Parsha, Rashi spells out the details, the two examples of Gmel Chasadim. Mashenkim b'Seif Parsha Sekev. Pasuk Laleches B'chol D'Rachav, Shemefarish, so over there in Parsha Sekev where Rashi is explaining, Laleches B'chol D'Rachav, so hu racham v'ata teracham. The Eibush is merciful, you should be merciful. Hu goyim chasadim v'ata gmel chasadim. Midbli levaya pratav shel gmel chasadim. And there Rashi does not explain what does gmel chasadim entail. Laleches b'chol drachav b'soif parsha sekev. There when the Torah writes to go in the Eibush's ways, nema b'hemshich u'kepirish la'ascholas inyan. It's a continuation and it's elaborating on what it begins. Kim shama tishmon as kol mitzvah zayis, to keep the mitzvahs asher anochi mitzvah eschem la'asayisa, that I command you to fulfill. U'mevayer u'mefarish, and then the Torah spells out la'ava savay lekecha la'leches b'chol derachav v'goyim, to love the Eibusha and go in his ways. So then came move on shekavanas hakosav la'alicha b'derachav hu goyim chasadim v'ata gmel chasadim. This includes all Gemilas Chasadim. It's not speaking about a specific category of Gemilas Chasadim. It's all inclusive. It also includes those that are clearly spelled out as a mitzvah in Torah. And this, when it says Leches b'chol derachav, is spelling out what it just mentioned before, those mitzvahs that the Eibusha commands you to do. But it also includes those that are not clear in Torah, that if the Eibusha is going mechsadim, you should as well. So over here, Rashi doesn't spell out because it's all inclusive. G'moil chasadim like the Eibusha. The Torah already tells us leches b'chol derachav. Hu goyim chasadim v'ata goyim chasadim. And the Yod, as we mentioned before, b'pasuk zeh kvan nemar, in this pasuk already says ves mitzvahs of tishmeru, mentions already the fulfillment of mitzvahs. And v'loy kagdom la'asiyim hakasav v'boisid bakum. It's not as a beginning that will follow up and elaborate when it concludes v'boisid bakum. El keprat b'fnei atzmai. There's two different things. There's the mitzvahs, and then there's v'boisid bakum. Hare move on, she'ena medu bekan b'chol inyanig gemilas chasadim. So over here, we're not talking about Gemilas Chasadim in general. Here we're talking about a specific category of Gemilas Chasadim where it's done even in a case where your Gemilas Chesed is not necessary. You're going above and beyond, like the Eibusha did it. So therefore Rashi spells out the two examples that fit into that category. So since over here Gmel Chasadim, Kvar Mesim u'Bakachelim, Kan, it's mentioned over here the Kvar Mesim u'Bakachelim, Hinam Ba'ifin, She'ein ala Adam la'asaysam. Talking about a case where the person is not obligated, Machmas Mitzvah v'Chiyav, because of any mitzvah or obligation. El Rak, Mishum Shakadosh Baruch Hu, Oise Kach, La'ala Adam Lidavik B'drachav. That the person is purely doing it because this is what the Eibusha does, and the person is attaching himself to the Eibusha. So this will also answer the question we asked before: why does Rashi bring the order kvar meisim va'achakach bakachelim? First kvura and then bakachelim. Both regarding the way that we see that Eibusha did this. As far as how it happens in the lifetime of a person. It should be the other way around. First bakachelim and then kvura. But Rashi here wants to emphasize the effort that the person is involving himself in doing this beyond what he's obligated. Kvar meisim. So when it comes to kvura, it's inyan tirche v'yegiyah. It's something that takes effort. Aval ein lezeh chashash she'adam yuzak al yidei zeh. There's no concern that the person himself could be harmed by kvura. Masha'enkin bakachelim, which is not the case when it comes to bikachelim, tirche v'yegiyah, There's also effort involved in this. Avul muetes ma'anal, less than kvura. Avul mokin lachsheish, but more importantly, there's a concern shahamevakir yuzak nemachlas shachavera, that if it's contagious, you may get the sickness of the person that you're visiting. So this is something that you're putting yourself, your own well-being, in danger by fulfilling this. So Rashi first brings kvar mesim and then bikachelim, ma'kala lakovet. Using a lighter example first, an example where a person is taka working hard, kvura, and in a case where what he's doing is not even, he wasn't personally needed, but yet he's not putting himself in harm's way. And then Rashi says an even bigger chiddush of bikachelim, you're doing something where you're not even needed, and you're doing it in a way that you're putting yourself in harm's way. The way Rashi quotes this is similar to the pasuk itself that begins from Achrei Avar Lekechem Telechu, and then it goes higher and higher until the Tachlis Advekus of Ubaisid Bakun. So Rashi as well says that in this Dvekus of Ubaisid Bakun, there's one level of Kvar Mesim, and then there's even more, which is Bakachelim. That you're doing something not needed, even when you're mamish sacrificing your own well-being. So now we can understand also why Rashi does not bring up the fact that the Eibusher was Menachem Avol, K'moishasa Kadosh Baruch Hu, K'moishkasa Vayach Remois Avram, Vayivarach Lekimes Yitzchak, that the Eibusher bench Yitzchak, which refers to Nichem Avelim. So the Rebbe explains the reason is, in the brackets the Rebbe says, Sherashi Hevisham Pirisheni. So here the Rebbe points out, if you take a look actually in Rashi there, what the pshat in Vayevarach Lekimes Yitzchak, you'll see that Rashi brings a second pshat. That doesn't necessarily mean Nichem Avelim. Shemizeh Muchach Shal Pipshute Shal Mikra Yeshne Keishi Ba'Pirish Nichmei Tenchumi Avelim. The pshat of Nichem Avelim is not so pashut. But besides that, move on hu b'mekolshkin v'kavachaymer mishnei advarim kvar mesim v'bakachelim. Once Rashi mentions these two examples of kvar mesim, where there's a big effort involved, and bikachelim, which, as we said, is even putting your own life or your own well-being in danger, it's already self-understood from this. If in a case where there's a big effort, hard work, like in the case of kvura, or in a case where there's a danger you can get sick, like bakachelim, a person has to attach himself and go in the Eibusher's ways and do these chasadim. Needless to say, in the case of Nichem Avelim, when you're going to be Menachem Avol somebody, Shein Bezel Derech HaRogel, in a usual case, like Tirche, like Shash Hezek L'Adam, there's no Tirche involved, and there's no concern of you harming yourself in any way. So therefore, there's no point in adding this other example here. Rashi is bringing these two examples, which is unique to the Eib, we find that the Eibusher did this in a way even when he wasn't needed. And here in these examples, you also see the unique effort and the unique thing that's person's doing here, and therefore it's not necessary anymore to mention at all Nichem Avelim. Avol al pizeh. The last question that Rebbe now addresses in the pshat of Rashi here. So now, if Rashi is bringing these two examples, and there's such a focus that these two examples show us clearly the Eibusher's Gemilas Chasadim, so Mikivin Sherashi Tzarech Lefaret Kvar Mesim Bakachelim, Rashi has to spell out these two examples. In Cain, Lamalei Rashi Lahaktem Aklal Dahadbek Bedrachav Gemal Chasadim. Why does Rashi bring the klal? Why does Rashi bring up the fact that these are details of Gemilas Chasadim? Havalei Lameima Hadbek Bedrachav Kvar Mesim Ubakachelim Kamoish Asa Kadosh Baruch Hu. He should have just mentioned Kvura and Bikachelim, and that includes everything. Why is it necessary for Rashi to bring up Gemilas Chasadim as the klal, and that the Kvura and the Bikachelim are details of this klal? Yuvan, so the Rebbe says, to understand this, let's look at the whole inyan of Gemilas Chasadim. There's an argument amongst the Rishonim that count mitzvahs when it comes to the different details that are included in Gemilas Chasadim. Nichem Avelim, Kvuras Mesim, Bikachelim, Halbashas Harumim, all these examples that we mentioned before. Shelefi Shittas HaBahag, according to the Bahag, Lefi Pirish HaRambam, the way that Rambam understands the Bahag, Nechshavais LeMitzvahs Miyuchadis Kol Echad B'fnei Atzmai. Each one is considered to be a separate mitzvah. The Torah shows us that the Eibusher did them in separate places, and therefore he says the Eibusher wants you to do them like the Eibusher did them, and each one is counted as a separate mitzvah. B'Shittas HaRambam, Shekula nechlalis b'mitzvah achas b'teira. No, all the details of Gemilas Chasadim are included in one mitzvah. V'ahavta l'reacha kamecha. The mitzvah v'ahavta l'reacha kamecha. Uprati ha-mitzvahs d'nichem avelim v'kvuras meisim v'bika chaylim b'tur mitzvahs miyuchadais he mitzvahs ha-sheshel devreim. Dividing them into separate mitzvahs, midrabanan, each one is a separate mitzvah for itself. But minat Torah, they're all considered to be included in one mitzvah of v'ahavta l'reacha kamecha. So now, this is the Bahag, and this is the Rambam. What does Rashi hold about this? Hine bezeh Rashi makdim hadbek bedrachav, gemoil chasadim, v'achar kach mefaret kvar meisim v'baka chaylim. When Rashi explains uvoisit bakon, Rashi says that it means gemilas chasadim. And then he spells out that gemilas chasadim entails kvar meisim v'baka chaylim. Harei umalamdeinu derech agav, shitos eshoyne binyan zeh. So derech agav, Rashi is teaching us that he has a different opinion, a third opinion on this matter. The fact that a person should connect and attach himself to the Eibishter's ways. L'meidin, where did we learn this out from? Not from what it says. And the Gemara darshans in this is a pasuk in Parshas Yisroi, the Eibishter's ways. Yelchu ze b'kachelim, and ba ze kvura. That Yelchu is one limud, ba is another limud. Kol mitzvah mi limud miyuchad. Both kvura and b'kachelim are learned from a separate word. So that's the source of the Bahag that says that it should be counted as separate mitzvahs. V'gam loy mi v'halachta b'drachav. It's also not learned out from v'halachta b'drachav, which it says in Parshas Kisavai, drachav shem loshen rabim. Kiyim rather mi uboy sidbakon. It's learned out according to Rashi from what it says here, uboy sidbakon. She'ein mudgish b'zeh remez l'nyanim rab. In uboy sidbakon, it means you should attach to the Eibishter. It doesn't talk about many things in this pasuk. It doesn't say a loshen rabim. Im kein al karchach sha mitzvah anul medis mizel yidavik b'drachav hu inyan echad g'moil chasadim. So what we understand from this is that the Torah here, it's using what? Singular term, it's really telling us one thing. G'moil chasadim. That's what Rashi begins with. It's a singular term, one g'moilas chasadim. Elo shekolol mehapratim dekvar meisim b'kachaylim. This one thing has details in it. It is expressed in the details of kvar meisim and b'kachaylim. Which means that Rashi's opinion is not like the opinion of the Bahag, Lefi Pirish Rambam, Shem mitzvahs miyuchodes b'minyan mitzvahs. There are separate words in the Torah that it's learned out from, or at least it's learned out from Drachav, which is Loshen Rabim, and therefore can be counted as separate mitzvahs. The Gamaloi Kedas Rambam Atzmai, and Rashi's opinion is also not like the Rambam that says Shem mitzvahs protiyas shel divrayim, that it comes from Ve'ahafta, but midrabanan it's separate mitzvahs. It comes from the mitzvah of Yahafta. Kiyem, rather, Rashi's shita is shehein mitzvah sasei achas de gemilos chasadim. It's one mitzvah of gemilos chasadim. Uvoi sidbokum, to attach yourself to the Eibishter. Hamischalekes lekama mitzvah sasei protim, and this one mitzvah is divided in many protis de mitzvahs. Kvar meisim, bakachaylim, chulu. So on one hand, minat Torah, it's one mitzvah, because the Torah writes a singular term of voisid bakun, but this very mitzvah of gemilas chasadim is divided into the many details of bakachaylim and minat Torah. It's divided into mitzvahs hasei pratim of kvar meisim and bakachaylim. According to the Rambam, v'ahavta l'reyacha kamoicha, which means love, to love your fellow. So you can't say that minat Torah, this is divided into pratim. Minat Torah, it's just one inyan. It's the feeling of ava. That's it. That's what the mitzvah is. So all these actions, minat Torah, are not pratim, are not divided into pratim. The Rabbanan made it into pratim. However, according to Rashi, uvoisid bakun means gemilas chasadim. And gemilas chasadim has these instances, these cases of gemilas chasadim that are mitzvahs hasei pratim. So therefore, minat Torah, you have these mitzvahs hasei pratim that are all included in this gemilas chasadim. In the Ha'ara, the Rebbe Bavarans, although in the Sikha we explained that the whole inyan of Ubaisid Bakken here is beyond the mitzvah, it's even in cases where it's not necessary. The Rebbe says, yes, true, that's the pshat of Ubaisid Bakken. But nevertheless, obviously Ubaisid Bakken also refers to cases where it's a chiyuv, and we can see Rashi's shitta b'nigeya to the mitzvah of Gemilas Chasadim and the details of this mitzvah. You can take a look in Ha'ara 53. Okay, this is the conclusion of the Rebbe's Hezber for all of the details in Rashi. the 4 different times the Torah uses the expression of dveikus. Really, we have 3 different levels of dveikus: the dveikus of ava, the dveikus of to be connected to talmidim and chachamim, and then the dveikus of going in the Eibishter's ways beyond when it's not even necessary to do it k'may sh'asa kadosh baruch hu. That's the highest level of dveikus, and all the other details that the Rebbe explained over here in the examples that Rashi brings. Here, the Rebbe will explain al pichsidus tesinyan, and the Rebbe will really come back also to answer the basic question over here: why is this inyan of doing milas chasadim, even takag milas chasadim, that's lefnim meshuras adin, even when you're not needed, but why is that considered to be the highest level of dveikus? So like the Rebbe said before, the tachlis adveikus. So the Rebbe here will explain this in the next, within what the Rebbe says, we'll see the hezbollah to this. Miyena shal teire shebepirish Rashi. Mikiven shetzivi zeh shala adam lidavik bedrachav. So this command that the Torah here says that a person should attach himself to the Eibishter. Last is k'may shasa kadosh baruch hu, to do like the Eibishter does. Nema ba'akasav b'lashon uvoisid bakum. The Torah chooses to say this with these words that you're becoming one. You're attaching yourself to the Eibishter. Talking about going in the Eibishter's ways, and the Torah expresses that by saying uvoisid bakum. The ultimate oneness and unity with the Eibishter. This, when a person does Gemilas Chasadim like the Eibishter, this is the ultimate expression of Dveikus. And it's not even the ultimate dveikus, the unity with the Eibishter, doesn't come out so powerfully when you fulfill mitzvahs. Hanema because of Lefneza, which says before this in the pasuk. This dveikus, this is the highest inyan. B'tzarech lahav, the question here is, halei mitzvah himeloshen tzavse v'chibah. The word mitzvah we know means not only a commandment but to connect to the Eibishter. Shayidei zeh nase hiskashrus v'hisachtus adam b'kadosh baruch hu. So the person becomes connected and one with the Eibishter. So ve'echav shalom, shalachrei ves mitzvaysav tishmeru, ba akasav lo'isav dveikus, she'aleh magia rak al yidei alicha b'dracha shal kadosh baruch hu. That after the mitzvahs, which is already a tzafsa v'chibah, nevertheless there's something additional that you arrive to this level of dveikus that only comes after this. And how? Through going in the Eibishter's ways. What level of dveikus is higher than becoming one with the Eibishter through the mitzvahs? So the pshat here is as follows. So let's really appreciate and understand what the real concept of dveikus is. Every mitzvah, the premise of a mitzvah is that there's a commander. There's a person that's listening and receiving a command, and there's a commander. The person is being commanded to fulfill this. The very fact that he has to be commanded, what does this prove? That the connection, the unity of the person with the Eibishter, there is an entity, there's a person here. There's the Eibishter, there's the commander, and then there's the entity of the person. A separate entity. And he receives the command, and he fulfills the command that the Eibishter commanded him to do. So as great as this dveikus is, or not dveikus, as great as this tzafsa v'chibur is, the premise of this whole tzafsa v'chibur is that there's 2 different entities here. Which is not the case with the expression of the words of voisid bakon. Although voices bakan itself is written in the Torah as a command, but nevertheless, what's the real concept of dveikus? The Torah is not telling you, even though it entails to go in the Eibishter's ways, but that's not how the Torah expresses it. The Torah does not say do gemilas chasadim, el ala dveikus. The real muhus and concept of what the Torah is speaking about over here is the dveikus. The oneness with the Eibishter. Dveikus is something else. Dveikus is we are one. Not that there's 2 entities and I'm following a command and that creates a connection. That creates a tzavsa v'chibur. Dveikus is to be megala the fact that who am I really? I'm one with the Eibishter. I am one with him. That's really what this dveikus over here means. It says it's tzivui. So the Rebbe says it's written b'derech tzivui, but what is the tzivui? The tzivui is to be one, to reveal the fact that you really are one. And then the Rebbe adds, Besigna nachiktsas, to answer this point here, that on one hand, the dveikus is beyond the command. It's a unity higher than a command, but at the same time, it's written as a tzivui. Af shemaschol b'zeh boisid bokun mipnei atzivui mehamitzav lahanetztave. Even if in the beginning a person is expressing his dveikus, he begins in his avedis Hashem as doing it as a command, because the Eibishter commands him to connect on this level. Hakim v'hashleimos nidbak b'amitzav. But then, ultimately, you become one. What you reveal is that you become completely one with the commander, that it's beyond a commander. It's not necessary to have a command. What gets revealed here is that you are one with the mitzvah. Chatchila, you and him are one. That's the real concept of dveikus. Dveikus is not two entities coming together. When you hear the word dveikus might sound like that you're attaching, you're bringing together two entities. That's not the real term dveikus. Dveikus means I'm attached because that's where I am, that's who I really am, that's my true mitzias. That's the real concept of dveikus. It begins through a mitzvah, but then the mitzvah is to come to the real concept of dveikus where you become one. Dugma ledava. The Rebbe brings an example for this, where you see that dveikus begins with a person doing it as a tzivui, and then it comes to something even higher, where you become one. Shmei Nesra. When we daven Shmei Nesra, the highest point of davening. So how does it begin? Hachane v'aschale. There's a preparation, and what's the beginning? Hikan lekras lekecha Yisrael. The person has to prepare for his davening. So there's the person that's doing this, the Eibishter, and he has to come towards the Eibishter and to speak to the Eibishter. So in that sense, it's two separate entities. But then, what's the davening itself? You come and you're there right in front of the king. At that point, there's nothing even that a person can show anything of his own expression. Like the example the Gemara says, even to make any signals of any sort. Absolute bittul standing in front of a king. All preparations you did before in your davening to come to this point, now even that expression of the davening itself shouldn't be expressed either. Standing just quietly with your feet together like a servant in front of a master. At that point, what does the person feel? I'm here in front of the master and I'm absorbed in his presence. I'm completely one with the master himself. So here you see this concept that it begins with the person's preparation, but it ultimately leads into the real Shmei Nesra, which is Avda Kamimari. So this is the real concept of dveikus. Dveikus is not the connection of two entities like in a mitzvah. Dveikus is revealing the fact that we are one entity. So now we can understand as well, the great level, as the Rebbe said before in the Sikha, the highest level of the whole list that the Torah says here, and this is incomparably greater than everything it says before in this pasuk, the mitzvah of gmilas chasadim, to fulfill uvaisid bakon, al gmilas chasadim, l'kayim mitzvah some kesef talva v'chayetze b'zeh. So before, when we learned the Sikha, so the Rebbe says there's Gemilas Chasadim, which is a chiyuv, when you're needed and you have to lend money to somebody. And then that's when you do it lifnim meshura sadin. Okay, so that hesber would be that it's a step above. You're doing it lifnim meshura sadin. But now the Rebbe is explaining to us, it's a completely different thing. What is this Gemilas Chasadim? If you're not needed, so why are you doing it? It's because it's K'moi Shas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If this is the Eibishter's character trait, if this is what the Eibishter does, since you are one, so you do the same way, b'derech mimela. It's an expression of the fact that you are one. If you're one with the Eibishter, so his character traits becomes yours and is expressed through you. That's the pshat over here of the fact that you do it even when you're not necessarily like the Eibishter did it. It's an expression of your dveikus in the Eibishter. So it's be'ein aroich. It's not just l'fnim m'shuras adin. It's a completely different level of connection to the Eibishter. So this also answers the question, which is gam al pi pshute shel mikra, a question that you could ask even in the simple pshat of the pasuk. Kivin shah pirishu hadbeg b'drachav. If the pshat of dveikus is to attach yourself in the ways of the Eibishter, or even the pshat that Rashi says in Ekev, talmidim v'chachamim v'chulu, to attach yourself to talmidim and chachamim, havalei l'meima b'kra mefurish. Why doesn't it say clearly in the Torah v'davak b'drachav v'chayetze v'zeh? Why doesn't the Torah talk about the drachav? Isn't that what it entails? Isn't it about the drachim of the Eibishter or talmidim and chachamim? Why doesn't the Torah say that? Elamai, the Torah wants you to understand what the essence of this thing is. The essence of this dveikus is dveikus, that you are one. The fact that you are one expresses itself that whatever the Eibusher does, you're doing as well, but derech memela, without a command. So the Torah is telling you the essence of the matter. It's not telling you the expression that it comes out in the fact that you're doing it k'moishas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's telling you what it is. It's real dveikus. That's the pshat, even in Pshuta Shel Mikra, the Rebbe says, in the concept of dveikus here. The Rebbe brings the story for this. Lahar ma mesuper oidis admar zaken. This is the story about the Alter Rebbe. Shekol an agaisav hoyu bedugma shel mayla mamish. Everything the Alter Rebbe did was similar to the way it was by the Eibishter. B'derech memela. Ulechein be'erev Shabbos Kodesh leis erev, and erev Shabbos Kodesh before evening, hoyu misnamne me'atzmai, he would fall into a sleep on his own. The Fishel uzman shina l'mayla, because al pi Kabbalah it says that this is a time of shina, above, and the Alter Rebbe was in the same state of being. So it happened b'derech memela because of him being one. It's not something he had to do. Mashenkin Rab Hillel meparish, regarding Rab Hillel Parisher, it says, Shalei hoya misnamne me'atzmai. He didn't fall asleep on his own. Ela sheshachav lisha. He went to schlafen. He went to sleep. He was following and going in the same way, the way it is above. But by Alter Rebbe it was dveikus, the ubaisid bakken, the way it is lamayla. Just like we find a similar thing, the way it is, the way the Eibishter responds to our avodah below. Mi Yisrael HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from Yidden to the Eibishter. Shenemar al zed, the pasuk says, Havayit tzilcha, the Eibishter is your shadow. Upirish Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov explains, Shekemoi b'tzeil adam lamata, just like with the shadow of a person. Kol asi yosav utnuosav shel adam, whatever movements and whatever a person does, chayzerim v'nasim b'tzeil shaloi b'derech memela. The shadow follows the person. It's not that the shadow is thinking and the shadow is doing what the person does. It's a reflection of him. It's one. The shadow is doing what he does. If this is what he does, that's what the shadow does. It's b'derech memela. Kainu kaviyachal l'mayla. All movements and everything a person does below, this is the response that happens above because of the unity between us and the Eibishter. So just as this is true as the Eibishter's response because of his connection to us, the same is also true from the Eibishter to the Yidden. What the Eibishter does, Yidden are doing the same thing. Because a person becomes so one with the Eibishter, he's automatically doing what the Eibishter does. This expresses the greatest dveikus, the high, the tachlis adveikus of Yidden with the Eibishter. This expresses the fact that Yidden are one. We're part of the Eibishter. When a Yid is connected and one with the Eibishter, and he does below what the Eibishter does, the fact that Yidden are one with the Eibishter, that really the Yidden and the Eibishter are one and the same entity. It's not two entities coming together, but we reveal the truth that it's chad mamish. And then the Rebbe concludes, this is something that's written here in the Torah. So it's a lesson to every single Yid. And the very fact that the Torah commands this, this is empowering every single Yid to reach this level, to be one with the Eibishter, through connecting and being one by going in the Eibishter's ways. As the Rebbe said before, it begins as a tzivui, that the Yid does it as a tzivui. And this is an asinis kayach to bring him to the real dveikus, that a person will automatically follow and do what the Eibishter is doing, like what the Eibishter does, because the Yid is one with the Eibishter himself.